Thomas Reed knelt in the dirt, 3 feet from the chain-link fence, hands trembling against cold metal. Dawn mist rose from wet grass as the white lion cub stumbled backward, small body shaking with fear. The father lion stood motionless behind his son, amber eyes fixed on Thomas, breathing slow and deliberate. "I just wanted to help," Thomas whispered, tears streaming down weathered cheeks. "I always just wanted to help." The cub whimpered a sound that pierced Thomas like a blade through old scar tissue. For 14 days he'd watched them walk the same route, father teaching blind son to navigate a world without sight. 14 days of perfect observation, of keeping his distance, of following the one rule he'd given himself: don't interfere. This morning, he'd broken it. His weathered hands reached through the fence, fingers grasping at nothing as the cub retreated further into his father's shadow. Those clouded, sightless eyes turned away from Thomas's desperate offering of frozen meat and misguided compassion. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. 6 months ago, Thomas Reed arrived at the Saint Laurent Wildlife Sanctuary in southern France, carrying one weathered suitcase and 15 years of silence. At 66, he moved like a man careful not to disturb the air around him, silver hair perpetually uncombed, hands calloused from decades of gripping coffee cups too tightly, eyes that slid away from direct contact as if eye contact might shatter something fragile inside. His French was minimal, his American accent thick as Portland rain. When Sanctuary Director Marie Dubois asked why he wanted to volunteer, he'd answered in careful, practiced words, "I need somewhere quiet." She'd given him a small cottage on the sanctuary grounds, expecting he'd last a month. Most volunteers burned out quickly. The work was tedious, the isolation complete, the pay non-existent. But Thomas settled in like a man who'd finally found the right size coffin. He took the same walk every morning at precisely 5:47 a.m., drank his coffee black at the same wooden table, spoke only when absolutely necessary. What Marie didn't know, what Thomas never mentioned, was that 5:47 a.m. was the exact time Daniel used to wake up. For 32 years, Thomas had been Portland's most sought-after grief counselor. Parents who'd lost children sat in his office and heard him say, with perfect clinical warmth, "Grief is not something you get over. It's something you learn to carry differently." He'd specialized in the worst kind of loss, the kind that hollowed people out from the inside. Everyone trusted him with their darkest pain because he seemed to understand it so completely. The irony was exquisite. His wedding ring hung on a chain around his neck Margaret had left 12 years ago with words that still echoed. "You're already gone, Thomas. I'm just making it official." His wallet held one photograph, Daniel at age 8, gap-toothed and laughing, taken 3 months before the diagnosis that would change everything. Retinitis pigmentosa, progressive blindness, no cure. Thomas had responded the way he responded to everything, with meticulous preparation and absolute control. He'd spent 8 years teaching Daniel to navigate a world without sight, creating elaborate systems of roots and sounds and textures. Every Saturday, they'd walk the same path through Central Park in Portland, Thomas always 10 steps ahead, calling back instructions. "This way, son, trust me." Daniel had trusted him. Right up until the delivery truck in the university parking lot, backing up with a broken beeper, and Daniel stepping into its path 3 months into freshman year. Thomas quit counseling 1 week after the funeral. He hadn't spoken Daniel's name aloud since. Day 1 began like every other morning at Saint Laurent. Thomas sat on his usual bench at 6:15 a.m., thermos of black coffee steaming in the cold air, expecting the kind of emptiness that had become comfortable. The sanctuary's lions rarely stirred before 8, preferring to sleep through the early dawn chill. He'd chosen this spot precisely because nothing ever happened here. Then movement caught his peripheral vision. A white lion emerged from the shelter across the enclosure, massive and deliberate in the gray morning light. Thomas had seen this male before. The sanctuary staff called him Aslan, but always at distance, always alone. This morning was different. Behind the father, stumbling on uncertain legs, came a small cub. Thomas's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. The cub's eyes were wrong. Even from 50 yards away, Thomas could see the milky cloudiness, the way the small head turned slightly askew, relying on senses other than sight. The little body moved hesitantly, each step a question rather than a statement, completely blind. The father lion moved with excruciating slowness, his normal predatory grace transformed into something almost ceremonial. He walked exactly 10 paces, then stopped, waited. The cub, nose to the ground, followed the scent trail left by his father's paws, small body weaving slightly but moving forward with determined concentration. When the cub reached his father, the male released a low rumble so deep Thomas felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled through earth and air. The cub's ears twitched in response, recognition, reassurance. Then the father walked another 10 paces and stopped again. Thomas's hands gripped the bench until his knuckles went bone white. His breath caught somewhere between his lungs and throat, trapped there by a recognition so profound it felt like drowning. He'd seen this before. He'd done this before. Daniel at age 11. Their Saturday walks through Central Park. Thomas always 10 steps ahead, always calling back, "Trust the path, son. I'll always be 10 steps ahead." The white lion father began walking a route along the perimeter fence, and Thomas watched with the hyper-focus of someone witnessing a ghost. 5 distinct stops, each one deliberate, an old oak tree, its bark thick with scent and texture. The father paused, let the cub investigate with his nose, learning the smell of age and moss, a water trough, where dripping created a constant rhythm. The cub's ears swiveled toward the sound, cataloging it, storing it as a landmark. A rocky outcrop where morning sun hadn't yet reached, temperature dropping noticeably in its shadow. The cub's body tensed at the change, then relaxed as his father rumbled approval. A maintenance shed, metal walls releasing the sharp tang of rust and oil. Foreign, human, but consistent. Another marker. Finally, back to the shelter. Full circle. A route completed. It was the same route. Not literally, these were different continents, different lives, but structurally identical to what Thomas had created for Daniel. The same careful repetition, the same trust that memorization would replace vision, the same patient belief that a world without sight could still be navigated with confidence. But there was something else, something in the father lion's posture that Thomas couldn't quite name. A quality of presence without anxiety, teaching without desperation. Thomas realized his face was wet. 15 years. 15 years since he'd cried, since he'd allowed himself to feel anything sharp enough to draw tears. These weren't sad tears, though grief threaded through them. These were tears of recognition, of seeing himself reflected in amber eyes and white fur, of watching someone else do what he'd spent 8 years attempting. "You're teaching him," Thomas whispered to the empty air. He sat on that bench until sunset, watching the father and cub repeat the route 3 more times, each repetition smoother than the last. The cub's confidence growing in tiny increments, the father's rumbles coming less frequently as the son learned to trust his own senses. When Marie Dubois found him still sitting there at 7 p.m., she brought him soup in concern. "Thomas, you've been here all day. Are you all right?" He couldn't answer directly. Instead, "That white lion, father? The one with the blind cub? How long has the cub been blind?" Marie studied him carefully. "Born that way. Genetic condition. We thought the father would reject him. Males usually don't invest in defective offspring, but he hasn't left that cub's side in 8 weeks. It's extraordinary. Really." Thomas's voice came out rough, unused. "I need to observe them. Every day. For as long as it takes. Thomas, they're wild animals, not therapy. I know what they are." He met her eyes for the first time since arriving in France. "I know exactly what they are. Will you let me watch?" Marie hesitated, then nodded slowly. Something in his face must have convinced her this wasn't about healing. It was about understanding something he'd lost the language to express. "Just observe," she said quietly. "Don't interfere." "I won't," Thomas promised. He had no idea, then, how hard that promise would become to keep. 7 days. 7 consecutive mornings watching the white lion father walk the same route with his blind son. And Thomas couldn't look away. He'd brought his camping chair on day 3, a thermos that stayed full because he forgot to drink. Binoculars he rarely used because the important details weren't visual, they were behavioral, rhythmic, precise as mathematics. He tried to document what he saw, pulling out the leather journal he'd carried for 15 years, pen hovering over blank pages. But his hand refused to move. Writing meant making it real, and he wasn't ready for that kind of reality yet. So he memorized instead, cataloging every detail in the failing architecture of his mind. The father's teaching methods emerged with crystalline clarity over those 7 days. He used his body to create wind blocks at certain points along the route, teaching the cub how air currents changed around solid objects. At dangerous spots near the fence posts, near jagged rocks, he paused longer, allowing the cub to sense the difference in his father's breathing, the subtle tension in the air that meant caution. Most remarkably, he never corrected when the cub stumbled, never rushed to prevent falls. He simply waited. That low rumble conveying a message Thomas was beginning to understand. You're safe to fail here. Learn from it. Thomas found himself comparing every gesture to his own history with Daniel. The memories came unbidden, sharp as glass. Daniel at 12, learning to cross the street. Thomas's voice, tight with anxiety. Stop. Listen. Now count to 5. Okay, now wait. Let me check traffic first. Daniel's small voice. Dad, you said I could do it myself. Thomas. I know, but let me just make sure. Always making sure. Always 10 steps ahead, but also hovering 3 steps behind. Creating a safety net so tight it became a cage. The white lion father never hovered. He led or he followed, but he never smothered. Day 7 brought the moment that split Thomas's understanding open like ripe fruit. The morning routine began as always, father emerging at dawn, cub following 10 paces behind. But at the 3rd stop, the water trough, something shifted. The cub's ears swiveled, catching the familiar sound of dripping water. His nose twitched, recognizing the mineral smell. And then, for the first time, he broke from the pattern. He moved ahead of his father. Thomas's breath stopped. His hand gripped the binoculars so tightly the metal bit into his palms. This was the test, the moment when a parent either allowed growth or crushed it with protective instinct. The father lion didn't move, didn't call out with a rumble, didn't rush forward to redirect. He simply stood, watching with those impossibly calm amber eyes as his blind son navigated familiar territory alone for the first time. The cub reached the water trough, lowered his head, drank deeply. Then, and this was the detail that broke something in Thomas's chest, the cub lifted his head, turned those sightless eyes back toward where his father stood, and waited. Not for permission, not for approval, simply acknowledging, I know you're there. The father released a single low rumble, a sound that seemed to say, yes, I'm here. I was always going to be here. But you didn't need me for this part, did you? The cub returned to his father's side, content, and they continued the route together. Thomas's hands were shaking so violently he had to set down the binoculars. The epiphany hit him with the force of physical violence he had never let Daniel lead, not once. 8 years of training, of careful route building, of patient instruction. And Thomas had always been the one in front, the one calling back, the one making every decision. The difference carved itself into his understanding with cruel precision. The lion father was teaching independence. Thomas had taught dependence. He trusts him, Thomas whispered to the empty morning. He actually trusts him. For 15 years, his leather journal had remained closed, its pages pristine and accusatory. Now, with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. Thomas opened it to the first page, his handwriting. When it came, was barely legible, the script of a man learning to write again after a stroke. 3 words. He trusts him. He stared at those words until they blurred, until they stopped being letters and became simply shapes, evidence that he was still capable of recording truth. When Thomas returned to his cottage that afternoon, he found a forwarded envelope on his doorstep. The postmark read Portland, Oregon. 3 weeks old. The return address made his stomach clench. Margaret's handwriting, unmistakable even after 12 years. He left it sitting on the small wooden table for 2 hours, circling it like it might detonate. Finally, as evening shadows stretched long across the floor, he opened it. The letter was short. Thomas, I don't know if you'll read this. I'm getting remarried. His name is Richard. He makes me laugh. I wanted you to know, not for permission, but because I finally forgave myself for leaving. I hope one day you can too. You were a wonderful father to Daniel. That accident wasn't your teaching, it was just the world being cruel. Please stop punishing yourself. M. Thomas read it 7 times. On the 7th reading, something inside him shifted. A tectonic plate grinding against 15 years of frozen grief. Margaret had moved on. Daniel, if he could speak from wherever the dead resided, would have moved on. The entire world had moved on, leaving Thomas alone in a parking lot that existed only in his memory, forever watching a delivery truck back up, forever unable to shout a warning loud enough to change the past. He crumpled the letter, then carefully smoothed it out again, then folded it precisely and placed it in his journal between the first and second pages. That night, he made a decision. I'll watch them until the father lets go, he said aloud to his empty cottage. Then I'll know if it's possible. He brought the camping chair back the next morning at 5:47 a.m., thermos filled, journal in his pocket, and committed himself to bearing witness to something he'd never learned how to love something enough to trust it with its own life. Marie noticed his daily vigil but said nothing. She'd seen enough grief in her 19 years managing the sanctuary to recognize when someone was searching for answers in the behavior of wild things. She just hoped, quietly, that Thomas would survive whatever answers he found. Week 2. The expansion day. 8 arrived with fog so thick Thomas could barely see the enclosure from his observation post. He almost stayed in the cottage, but the thought of missing even one day felt like betrayal, though betrayal of what, or whom? He couldn't articulate, so he sat in the gray dampness, thermos warming his hands, and waited. The white shapes emerged from mist like ghosts materializing, father and son, beginning their routine. But today, something changed. Instead of turning left toward the familiar oak tree, the father turned right, new territory. Thomas leaned forward, every muscle tense. The cub hesitated, small head swiveling in confusion. The scent trail led a different direction. The sounds were unfamiliar. For a long moment, the cub didn't move, small body rigid with uncertainty. The father didn't come back, didn't rumble reassurance, simply stood 20 paces away, waiting. The cub whimpered a sound that drove ice picks through Thomas's composure. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to call out, to do something. His hands gripped the chair arms until his knuckles cracked. After what felt like hours but was probably 90 seconds, the cub took one tentative step forward, then another, following his father into unknown territory, trusting that the pattern would hold even when the path changed. The father led him to a dense thicket of brush, the 6th location. Thomas cataloged mentally. The cub approached cautiously, nose working overtime. When he touched the first branch, he jerked back, startled by the unfamiliar texture, stood there, trembling. The father lay down 10 feet away. The message was clear. Figure it out. I'm not leaving. But I'm not doing it for you either. Thomas watched the cub spend 20 minutes exploring that brush, learning how branches caught on fur, how leaves rustled differently than grass, how the density created pockets of different temperature. By day 10, the cub navigated the brush area with confidence, had incorporated it into his mental map of the world. Thomas's journal entry that night, his handwriting growing steadier. He's not protecting him from the world. He's teaching him how to be in it. Below that, added later in shakier script, I wrapped Daniel in bubble wrap. This father wraps his son in experience. The memory came unbidden. Daniel at 12, refusing to attend the new school across town. Thomas had spent 3 hours explaining the importance of education, the opportunities this school provided, the careful arrangements he'd made with administrators for Daniel's accommodations. What he'd never done was ask Daniel if he was afraid. Never let Daniel sit with the fear. Feel it. Learn that fear wasn't fatal. Daniel had attended the school, had been miserable for 6 months, had never told Thomas because Thomas didn't leave space for failure in his carefully constructed plans. Day 11 brought weather that changed everything. Thomas arrived at his post to find dark clouds rolling in from the east, the kind that promised violence. He'd brought a rain jacket, prepared to wait out the storm. Surely the father would keep the cub in the shelter today, would protect him from the elements. At 6:30 a.m., the rain started. Heavy, wind-driven, the kind that stung exposed skin. At 6:32 a.m., the father emerged from the shelter. The cub followed. Thomas stood up, panic rising in his throat. No, no, what are you doing? The father led the cub directly into the open area, the most exposed section of the enclosure, then stopped, stood there, let the rain hammer down on both of them. The cub was terrified. Thomas could see it in every line of his small body, the way he pressed against his father's legs, the way his ears flattened against his skull. But the father didn't move toward shelter. He simply stood, breathing calmly, letting his son experience this new reality. After 10 minutes, something remarkable happened. The cub stepped away from his father's protection, lifted his face to the rain, began to understand rain sounds different on dirt than on rocks, different on the metal fence than on leaves, different on his own fur than on his father's. These weren't just sounds. They were information, navigation tools, the world revealing itself through water. 20 minutes into the storm, the father finally led the cub back to shelter, both soaked, but the cub's trembling had stopped. He'd learned something essential. New experiences aren't always dangerous. Sometimes they're just new. Thomas sat in the rain long after they'd gone inside, his journal getting soaked, ink running. He didn't care. "I never let him get wet," he whispered. "I never let him feel anything I could prevent." Week 3, the breaking point. Day 14 began with Thomas waking at 3 a.m., unable to return to sleep. For 13 days, he'd watched the father lion teach his son with a patience that seemed almost supernatural. For 13 days, Thomas had kept his promise to Marie observe. Don't interfere, but watching wasn't enough anymore. The need to help, to contribute, to prove he understood what he was witnessing, it had been building like pressure behind a dam. He arrived at the observation post at 5 a.m., 2 hours early, carrying a small package of fresh meat from the sanctuary kitchen. The father and cub had been receiving standard rations, but Thomas had noticed the cub was thinner than seemed healthy. Surely supplementing their diet would help. Surely this would demonstrate that he understood what they needed. At 6:15 a.m., when the father and cub emerged, Thomas approached the fence. The father's head swung toward him immediately, amber eyes locking on, not aggressive, but watchful. The cub, following his father's scent trail, continued forward, unaware. Thomas pushed the meat through the chain-link fence, making soft clicking sounds he'd heard the sanctuary staff use. The cub's head lifted, nostrils flaring. An unfamiliar smell, human smell, mixed with food. The small body went rigid, confused, frightened. He whimpered and stumbled backward. The father didn't move toward Thomas, didn't investigate the meat. He simply stood, breathing slowly and deliberately, eyes still fixed on Thomas. The cub's fear escalated. He called out, a higher-pitched sound of distress, backing away from the fence, from the strange smell, from the disruption in his carefully learned routine. Still, the father didn't react, didn't comfort, just breathed, steady, calm, present. It took 3 minutes an eternity before the cub's breathing synchronized with his father's, before the small body relaxed. Not because the threat had gone away, but because the father's calm communicated, "This isn't dangerous, just different. You're learning." That's when Thomas understood what he'd done. The father had been teaching the cub that unknown things weren't inherently threatening if you remained calm. That panic was optional. That you could encounter the unfamiliar and survive it by controlling your response rather than the situation. And Thomas had interfered with anxiety, with desperate helping, with the same suffocating care that had defined every interaction with Daniel. He sank to his knees in the dirt, hands still gripping the fence, tears streaming down his face. "I've done it again," he choked out. "I've scared him. I just wanted to help. I always just wanted to help." That's where Marie found him 20 minutes later. She approached slowly, the way you approach someone standing on a ledge. "Thomas, come away from the fence." He didn't move. "My son was blind. He died. I couldn't save him. I thought maybe." His voice broke completely. Marie knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You thought you could save a lion cub instead. I thought I could watch someone do it right." The words came out broken, scattered. "But I can't even watch without interfering. I can't even get observation right." "What happened to your son?" The story spilled out in fragments. Daniel, the diagnosis, 8 years of careful training, the university, the parking lot, the delivery truck, the funeral Thomas had attended but never processed, the 15 years of running. Marie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat beside him in the dirt, both of them staring at the 2 white lions who had resumed their route as if nothing had happened. "That father lion," Marie said quietly. "We call him Aslan. He was rescued from a circus 5 years ago. Spent his whole life in a cage barely big enough to turn around in. They beat him when he didn't perform. Starved him when he showed aggression." Thomas looked at her, uncomprehending. "He knows what it's like to be trapped, to be helpless, to have every choice taken away." Marie's voice was gentle but firm. "Maybe that's why he's so patient with that cub. He's not just teaching survival. He's teaching freedom. The freedom to stumble, to be afraid, to figure things out without someone else controlling every variable." "I took Daniel's freedom," Thomas whispered. "You loved your son. Sometimes love gets confused with control when we're terrified of losing what we love." She stood, offered him her hand. "But Thomas, you can't rewrite your story by interfering with theirs. If you want to learn from them, you have to actually watch, not project, not help, just witness." "I don't know if I can do that." "Then maybe you're not ready to be here." The words hit like a slap. Thomas stood slowly, every joint aching. "I'll stay back. I promise. I need to see how this ends." Marie studied him for a long moment. "The father will leave soon. You know that, right? In the wild, male lions leave their cubs around 12 months. This cub is 11 months old." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. "But he's blind. He can't." "He can, because his father is making sure of it. That's what you're watching." Thomas. Not just teaching. Preparation for inevitable separation. She paused. "The cub will stay in the sanctuary. The father will be moved to an adjacent enclosure. They'll both be safe, but they'll be apart. That's cruel. That's nature. And maybe that's the lesson you actually need." Week 3 continued. The deepening days, 15 through 18, passed in disciplined silence. Thomas kept his distance, didn't bring food, didn't approach the fence, just watched. The father's teaching had entered a new phase. He began introducing the cub to other sanctuary animals through the fence: a zebra in the neighboring enclosure, birds that landed on fence posts, the sanctuary's domestic cat that sometimes wandered the perimeter. Each introduction was controlled, calm, teaching the cub that the world was full of other creatures, each with their own sounds and smells and patterns. Thomas documented everything now, his journal filling with observations written in increasingly steady handwriting. The act of writing had become meditation, a way to process what he was seeing without drowning in what it meant. Day 19, he attempted something new. "Dear Daniel," he wrote at the top of a fresh page. His hand trembled, but he forced himself to continue. "I'm watching a father teach his son to be blind. No, that's wrong. He's teaching him to be alive. I don't think I knew the difference." He couldn't finish it. The words piled up behind his pen. Too many, too heavy. a 15-year backlog of things he'd never said. He closed the journal, but he kept the page. Progress was progress, even when incomplete. Day 20 brought an unexpected visitor. An elderly Frenchwoman approached his observation post mid-morning, moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating bones that no longer obeyed reliably. She had to be in her 80s, silver hair pulled back severely, eyes sharp as broken glass. She sat on the ground beside his chair without asking permission, studying not the lions but Thomas himself. After 5 minutes of silence, she spoke in accented English. Vous cherchez quelque chose? You're looking for something. Thomas didn't know how to answer honestly. Finally, absolution, maybe. Ah! She nodded as if he'd confirmed something. Les lions ne donnent pas l'absolution, seulement des leçons. Lions don't give absolution, only lessons. I'm learning that. She watched the father and cub complete their route, then stood with effort. Before leaving, she placed a weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder. The father will leave eventually. All fathers must. The question is whether you'll be ready to watch it. I don't think I have a choice. We always have a choice. Stay and learn, or run again. She smiled, not unkindly. You've been running a long time. I think maybe it's time to stand still. She left before he could ask her name. He would later learn from Marie that she was Claudette, a local woman who'd lost her own son to cancer 30 years ago. She came to the sanctuary when grief got too heavy, finding comfort in watching life persist despite loss. Day 21 brought the shift Thomas had been dreading. The morning routine began as always, but halfway through, the cub deviated from the pattern, not out of confusion, out of confidence. He chose a different path to the water trough, one that required navigating around obstacles the father hadn't specifically shown him. The father didn't correct him, didn't redirect, simply followed at a distance, allowing his son to apply learned principles to new situations. The cub reached the water trough perfectly, having navigated entirely on his own judgment. Thomas wrote in his journal, he doesn't need the father for every step anymore. The foundation is complete. What comes next is... He couldn't finish the sentence because finishing it meant acknowledging what Claudette and Marie had both warned him about: the separation was coming. The father had nearly completed his work, and Thomas would have to watch a goodbye he'd never given Daniel, delivered by creatures who understood letting go better than he ever had. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The question Claudette had posed haunted him. Would he be ready to watch it? He didn't know. But he was beginning to suspect that ready wasn't the point. Bearing witness was the point. Staying present for the entire story, even the parts that broke your heart, especially those parts that was the lesson. He just wasn't sure he was strong enough to learn it. Day 22 shattered every assumption Thomas had built over 3 weeks of observation. He arrived at his post at 5:47 a.m. to find the shelter entrance empty. The father lion didn't emerge at 600, didn't emerge at 6:15. By 6:30, Thomas's hands were shaking around his thermos, coffee growing cold and forgotten. At 6:45, the blind cub appeared alone at the shelter entrance. Thomas stood up so fast his camping chair tipped backward. The cub stood there, small head swiveling, nose working the air, clearly searching for his father's scent. Waited. 1 minute. 5 minutes. 10. The whimpering started at minute 12. Soft, confused vocalizations that seemed to ask, "Where are you? This isn't the pattern. You're always here." Thomas's chest constricted, pain radiating down his left arm. His breath came in short, inadequate gasps. Every instinct screamed to run to the sanctuary office, to demand intervention, to fix this abandonment before it became permanent. At minute 30, the cub did something extraordinary. He began the route. Alone. Thomas watched, unable to breathe properly. As the blind cub navigated from memory, the oak tree he found it, rubbed his face against the familiar bark. The water trough he located it by sound, drank calmly. The rocky outcrop, the maintenance shed, the brush area, every location, executed with precision that spoke of perfect internalization. The cub completed the entire route without a single mistake. When he returned to the shelter entrance, he looked back once toward the interior darkness where his father presumably waited, then lay down in the sun, calm, not panicked, simply adjusted. Thomas grabbed his phone with trembling hands, called Marie. "Something's wrong," he choked out. "The father didn't come out. The cub is alone. He's blind. Marie, he can't—" "Thomas." Her voice was gentle but firm. "The cub is 11 months old. In the wild, fathers begin separating at 12 months. This is natural. But he's blind. He needs to be ready, and the father knows that." A pause. "This is what you've been watching, Thomas. Not just teaching. Preparation for the inevitable." Thomas ended the call, sank back into his chair. Through the chain-link fence, he could see into the shelter's dim interior now. The father lion was there, lying in the shadows, completely visible to Thomas but remaining still, silent, watching his son handle independence, not abandonment, a test. Day 23 brought something worse. The father emerged at dawn, but he didn't begin the familiar routine. Instead, he led the cub to areas they'd carefully avoided for 3 weeks. The fence gaps where posts had separated slightly. The steep embankment near the northern edge where erosion had created treacherous footing. The deepest part of the water trough where a small cub could stumble and struggle. Not to teach navigation, to teach danger recognition. Thomas watched the father show his son every potential threat in their enclosed world. The message was unmistakable. These things exist. You can't avoid them by staying on safe paths forever. You need to know where they are and respect them. By afternoon, Thomas couldn't contain himself any longer. He found Marie in her office, and the argument that followed stripped away every pretense of calm observation. "You can't just let the father abandon him." Marie looked up from paperwork, unsurprised. "We're not letting anything, Thomas. This is wild animal behavior. We observe, we don't interfere. He's blind. He'll die out there alone." Thomas's voice cracked on the last word. "He's not going out there. He's staying in the sanctuary. But the father is preparing him for independence within this space. That's responsible parenting." "Responsible? How can you be so calm about a father just walking away from a disabled child?" Marie set down her pen, met his eyes with uncomfortable directness. "Is that what we're really talking about? The lion cub or Daniel?" Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. "Don't. Your son wasn't disabled, Thomas. He was blind. There's a difference. One is a medical condition. The other is a judgment about worth." Her voice softened. "And from what you've told me, Daniel was doing fine until a random accident took him. The same accident that could have killed a sighted person who happened to be in the wrong place. I should have prepared him better. Or maybe," Marie leaned forward, "maybe some things can't be prepared for. Maybe that's the actual lesson here. That father lion is teaching his son everything he can control. And then he's going to step back and trust that it's enough. Because he knows he can't protect against every possible danger." Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "How do you just let go when you know how cruel the world can be? I've watched 19 years of wildlife, Thomas. Fathers who hold on too long raise weak cubs. Mothers who never separate raise children who can't survive their first challenge. This father knows something you're still fighting. Love isn't measured by how tightly you hold on. It's measured by whether they can stand alone when you let go." That night, Thomas didn't sleep. The memories came in relentless waves. Daniel's first day at the University of Oregon. Thomas had called 12 times. 12. Checking if Daniel had found his dorm, if his roommate was helpful, if he'd located all his classes, if he needed anything. Anything at all. Daniel had finally answered the 12th call with barely controlled frustration. "Dad, I'm fine. You have to stop." I just need to know you're okay. No. Daniel's voice had gone quiet. Serious. You need me to need you. That's different. They hadn't spoken for 2 weeks after that argument. The next call had come from a hospital administrator, informing Thomas that his son had been struck by a vehicle in a parking lot, dead on arrival. Thomas had spent 15 years wondering, was Daniel distracted that day, angry at his father, trying so hard to prove his independence that he took unnecessary risks? What if the accident happened because Thomas had pushed him away by holding on too tight? What if his son had died still trying to escape his father's suffocating love? He wrote in his journal at 3 a.m., handwriting barely legible through tears. Daniel tried to leave. I held on. He died still trying to prove he didn't need me. What if the accident happened because he was distracted, angry at me, trying too hard to be independent to prove a point? What if my holding on pushed him into danger? Day 24 arrived with Thomas hollow-eyed and desperate. He went to Marie's office before dawn, before he could talk himself out of it. If the father lion leaves, I want to volunteer to care for the cub. Marie didn't even look up from her computer. Absolutely not. I have experience with blind. You have trauma, Thomas. That cub doesn't need a replacement father. He has one, and that father's job is almost done. Then what am I supposed to do? The words came out raw, stripped of dignity. Marie finally met his eyes. Watch. Learn. Trust that some creatures know how to let go better than we do. She paused. And maybe start asking yourself why you're so determined to insert yourself into this story. Is it really about helping the cub? Or is it about proving you could have saved Daniel if given a second chance? Thomas left without answering because he didn't have an answer that wouldn't destroy him. Day 25 brought the final teaching walk. Father and cub emerged together one last time. The route was familiar, but the execution was different. At each of the 5 original stopping points, the oak tree, water trough, rocky outcrop, maintenance shed, brush area, the father did something Thomas had never seen before. He placed his massive paw deliberately in the soft dirt, pressed down, created a clear print, then lowered his head and gently pushed his son's nose toward the impression. The cub sniffed carefully, learning the exact size and shape of his father's paw, memorizing it. The father repeated this at all 5 locations. The message was unmistakable. I was here. I taught you. Remember. Not just remember the locations. Remember me. Remember that you were loved enough to be taught. Remember that preparation is a form of devotion. Thomas's vision blurred. He was openly weeping now, past caring who saw. His whole body shook with sobs he'd suppressed for 15 years. Claudette appeared beside him as if summoned by grief itself. She sat on the ground next to his chair, said nothing for 20 minutes. Finally, grief is not what we feel when they go. Grief is what we feel when we realize we can't go with them. Thomas couldn't speak, could only nod. You never let him go, did you? You're Daniel? No. Then maybe this father is teaching both of you. She gestured toward the lions. Watch carefully. He's showing you how it's done. Thomas watched. The father completed the paw print ritual, then stood before his son, lowered his massive head and touched his nose to the cub's forehead, the first overtly affectionate gesture Thomas had witnessed in 25 days. Then the father turned and walked away, slowly, with dignity, not looking back. The cub stood alone, facing the direction his father had gone, those clouded eyes seeing nothing but somehow understanding everything. And Thomas finally understood, too. The greatest act of love isn't holding on. It's letting go with grace. It's teaching everything you can, then trusting it was enough. It's stepping back so they can step forward. It's saying goodbye while you still can, so they know they were loved, not abandoned. It's what he'd never given Daniel, and what this white lion father was about to give his blind son. The lesson Thomas had traveled 6,000 miles and 15 years to learn. Day 26 began at 5:47 a.m. with Thomas already at his observation post, as if arriving early might prevent what he knew was coming. The pre-dawn air carried the scent of rain, though the sky remained clear. Everything felt poised on the edge of something irrevocable. At 6:00, the father lion emerged from the shelter, alone. He walked directly to the fence line where Thomas sat, 30 feet separating them. For 26 days, they'd existed in the same space but different worlds. Now, for the first time, the father looked directly at Thomas. Amber eyes met human blue. And something passed between them, not understanding exactly, but recognition. Two fathers, two different species. One shared truth. The white lion lay down, facing Thomas. Release that low rumble Thomas had heard dozens of times directed at the cub. But this rumble was for him. Watch carefully. It seemed to say, "This is how it's done." At 6:15, the cub emerged, began the route without prompting. Perfect execution. Every turn, every stop, every cautious navigation around obstacles, all of it internalized so completely it looked effortless. The father didn't follow, didn't move, just watched his son demonstrate competence, independence, readiness. When the cub completed the circuit and returned to the shelter entrance, he paused, turned his blind face toward where his father lay. A long moment of stillness, of silent communication that needed no eyes to transmit. Then the father stood, walked slowly to the cub, touched noses, once a gesture of such tenderness. Thomas felt his throat close. The father turned, walked his son to the shelter entrance, waited until the cub was inside. Then he walked to the opposite end of the enclosure, the farthest point from the shelter, and lay down with his back turned. He didn't look back. The cub emerged 3 minutes later, calling out, confused vocalizations, seeking his father's location. The father's ears twitched, but he didn't turn, didn't respond. His breathing remained steady, deliberate, a study in disciplined separation. The cub's calls grew more desperate, higher pitched. The sound of a child realizing the pattern has shattered. The safety net has been removed. The constant presence has withdrawn. Thomas was on his feet, hands gripping the fence. No, no, no. Not like this. For 3 hours, the cub paced and called. For 3 hours, the father lay motionless, back turned, refusing to respond. For 3 hours, Thomas watched what looked like cruelty but was actually the hardest form of love. He couldn't bear it. He found Marie at the sanctuary entrance, barely coherent. This is cruelty. He's traumatizing that cub. Marie's face was sad but unsurprised. He's teaching him that some separations are final. Better to learn it with a safety net than in the wild. You call this a safety net? That cub is terrified. The cub is fed, sheltered, and his father is still alive, just distant. Yes, Thomas, that's a safety net. The cub is learning that he can survive emotional pain, that fear isn't fatal, that being alone doesn't mean being abandoned. I can't watch this. Then don't. But running won't change what's happening. Thomas ran anyway, back to his cottage, slamming the door so hard the frame cracked. He stood in the center of the small room, chest heaving, 15 years of compressed grief detonating like a shaped charge. The table went over first, coffee cups shattering, the thermos rolling into the corner, then the chair, thrown against the wall, the lamp, reduced to fragments. He tore through the cottage like a tornado, destroying anything within reach, trying to make the external world match the internal devastation. He found the unfinished letter to Daniel among the wreckage. Read the words he'd written on day 19. I'm watching a father teach his son to be alive. Teach him what? Thomas screamed at the paper. How to abandon, how to turn your back. He ripped the letter into pieces, then into smaller pieces. then into confetti that scattered across the destroyed cottage floor like snow. The bottle of whiskey he'd bought in the Portland airport 6 months ago, never opened, suddenly seemed like the only rational response. He broke the seal at 4 p.m., took his first drink in 10 years, then another, then stopped counting. By nightfall, he was sitting in the wreckage, back against the overturned table, talking to Daniel as if his son sat across from him in the gathering darkness. "You never said goodbye, Dad?" Daniel's voice in his memory, or imagination, or alcohol-soaked hallucination. "You didn't give me a chance. I tried to leave for months. You wouldn't let me, because I loved you." No. The imagined Daniel's voice was gentle, sad. "Because you needed me to need you. There's a difference." Thomas covered his face with his hands. "I just wanted to keep you safe. You wanted to keep me close." Safe was the excuse. The bottle was half empty. The cottage was destroyed. Thomas's hands were bleeding from broken glass, though he couldn't remember cutting them. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered except the truth he'd spent 15 years evading. Daniel had been trying to leave. Not because he didn't love his father, because he needed to grow. And Thomas had held on so tightly that his son had died, still trying to prove he could stand alone. Day 27 arrived with brutal sunlight and a headache that felt like divine punishment. Thomas didn't go to his observation post, didn't leave the cottage, lay among the wreckage of his temporary life and stared at the ceiling, wishing for the mercy of continued unconsciousness. Marie knocked at 10 a.m. He didn't answer. At noon, Claudette slipped a note under the door. He read it from the floor without moving. "The cub is eating. The father is still there. Both are okay. Are you?" Thomas crumpled the note. He wasn't okay. Hadn't been okay in 15 years. Wouldn't be okay if he lived another 50. Around 3 p.m., motivated by nothing except the biological imperative to move, he pulled out his journal. 27 days of observations. He read through every entry, seeing for the first time what he'd actually been documenting. Every single entry focused on what the father was doing. The father's teaching methods. The father's patience. The father's preparation for letting go. Not one entry asked what the CUB felt. Not one entry considered the experience from the son's perspective. Not one entry acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, the cub was ready. That the separation wasn't trauma, but graduation. Thomas had made it all about fathers, about what they lose, about their pain, their fear, their desperate need to remain necessary. "I'm still making it about me," he whispered to the empty cottage. "About fathers. About what we lose. Never about what they gain." The memory surfaced unbidden. Daniel's funeral, Forest Lawn Cemetery, Portland, October rain making everything gray and slick. Margaret standing beside him, black dress, white face, silent tears. The minister saying words that meant nothing. Friends and colleagues offering condolences that landed like stones. Thomas had stood there, dry-eyed, frozen, completely absent from his own son's goodbye. Margaret had whispered, "Say something. Anything." What's there to say? That you're glad he was yours. That he was ready. That you're proud. Thomas had looked at her like she'd suggested he dance on the casket. "I'm not glad. He wasn't ready. I failed." Margaret had walked away then, left the funeral early, left the marriage 6 months later, left Thomas alone with his certainty that love meant never letting go, and losing meant you hadn't held tight enough. She'd been right to leave. He'd been dead for 15 years, just hadn't had the decency to stop walking around. At 2 a.m., Thomas made a decision. He packed the one suitcase he'd brought to France, left the journal on the destroyed table, wrote a note to Marie, "I can't watch the ending, I'm sorry." He drove to Lyon-Saint-Exupéry Airport in the dark, returned the rental car, bought a one-way ticket to Portland. The flight left at 6:35 a.m. He boarded without looking back. By noon, Marie found the cottage empty, the note on the table, and understood. Some people run toward their pain, others run from it. Thomas had finally decided which kind he was. But what neither Thomas nor Marie knew was that running toward and running from sometimes end up at the same destination. Sometimes you have to go back to the beginning to understand how it should have ended. Sometimes the only way forward is through the past you've been avoiding. Thomas was finally going home, not to heal, not yet, but to face what he should have faced 15 years ago. The goodbye he'd never given. Portland International Airport welcomed Thomas with gray skies and the smell of rain on concrete familiar as his own breathing, painful as reopened wounds. He'd left this city 15 years ago in pieces. Returning felt like willingly stepping back into the car accident, choosing to relive the impact in slow motion. He rented a car with hands that barely functioned, drove south on I-5 toward Forest Lawn Cemetery. Traffic moved around him like water around a stone. He couldn't remember the last time he'd driven in America. Everything felt too fast, too loud, too present. The cemetery gates appeared exactly as he remembered them, which seemed impossible. Shouldn't 15 years of absence create some visible change? But the black iron scrollwork remained unchanged, indifferent to his long absence. He parked in the visitor lot, sat gripping the steering wheel for 20 minutes. His phone showed 2:47 p.m., day 28 since he'd first seen the White Lion father, 43 hours since he'd fled France, an entire lifetime since he'd last stood at his son's grave. Because he'd never stood at his son's grave. The realization hit him with fresh shame. He'd attended the funeral, watched the casket lowered, then left and never returned. Margaret had handled the headstone, the plot selection, all the administrative grief, while Thomas had simply vanished. Inside the cemetery office, a groundskeeper looked up from paperwork, late 60s, kind eyes, the weathered face of someone who spent their days among the dead and had learned gentleness from it. "Can I help you find someone?" "My son, Daniel Reed. He died in 2010. The words felt like stones in his mouth. The groundskeeper consulted his computer, his expression shifting to something softer. "Section D, plot 247, pretty spot under the oak trees." A pause. "Woman comes monthly with flowers. Your wife." Thomas's voice nearly failed. "Ex-wife. She was here 3 days ago. Actually, always brings white roses." The information landed like a physical blow. Margaret had been visiting for 15 years, every single month, tending a grave Thomas had abandoned, maintaining a connection he'd severed, doing the work of remembrance while he'd been busy running. "Thank you," Thomas managed. "Take your time. We close at 6. Section D stretched along the eastern edge of the cemetery, mature oak trees providing dappled shade. Thomas walked slowly, reading names and dates, each headstone a story of grief he'd counseled others through but never processed himself. Plot 247 sat beneath the largest oak, exactly as the groundskeeper had promised. The headstone was simple granite, elegant in its restraint. Daniel James Reed, 1985-2010. He saw beauty in everything. Fresh white roses sat in the built-in vase. Margaret's roses. 3 days old but still beautiful. Thomas's legs gave out. He sank to the grass, pressed his palm against the stone that marked where his son's body lay, and tried to speak. Nothing came. His throat had closed completely, his chest constricted, his entire body rejecting this moment he should have allowed 15 years ago. After 2 hours of silence, he finally whispered, "I don't know how to do this." "First time visiting?" Thomas jerked around. A young man stood a respectful distance away, mid-20s, messenger bag across his shoulder, holding his own small bouquet of flowers. Concern etched across a kind face. "I'm sorry, didn't mean to intrude," the young man continued. "I visit someone nearby. Couldn't help but notice you seemed—" He gestured helplessly. "Yes." Thomas's voice was scraped raw. "First time visiting. Me too. Well, first time alone. Used to come with my dad. The young man's face shadowed. He died last year. Made me promise to keep visiting Mom's grave. Said she'd be lonely. Something in his tone made Thomas ask, "Are you okay with that?" The young man, Jake. He introduced himself, sat on the grass a few feet away, setting his flowers aside. Honestly, first few months I hated it. Felt like he was controlling me from beyond the grave. A sad smile. But then I realized he wasn't making me do it for her. He was giving me a place to remember them. Both of them. Silence settled between them, comfortable in its shared understanding of loss. "Finally," Thomas asked, "what if you failed someone? How do you visit their grave then?" Jake considered this carefully. "Did they think you failed them? I don't know. We fought before it happened. My dad and I fought the week before his heart attack," Jake said quietly. "Stupid argument about me dropping out of grad school. Last thing I said to him was, 'You never support my decisions.' Next day, he collapsed at his desk, dead before the ambulance arrived. I'm sorry. Thank you. But here's the thing. Guess what I found in his wallet after he died?" Thomas shook his head. "My acceptance letter to grad school. He'd kept it for 3 years. Corners all worn from taking it out to look at it. He was proud. I just couldn't see it through my anger." Thomas felt something crack in his chest. "My son was going blind. Progressive condition. I spent 8 years teaching him to navigate the world without sight. Then he died in a parking lot because a delivery truck was backing up and he didn't hear it. Jesus. I'm so sorry. I taught him everything except..." Thomas's voice broke. "Except how to fail. How to make mistakes and be okay with them. I was so afraid the world would hurt him that I never let him experience small hurts. The ones that teach you to protect yourself. You think that's why the accident happened?" "No. Yes. I don't know." Thomas pressed his palms against his eyes. "But I know I was so busy protecting him that I never asked if he felt free, if my love felt like safety or suffocation." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried hard-won wisdom. "My therapist told me something after Dad died. She said I could spend my life wondering if things I said hurt him, or I could trust that he knew I loved him. She said, 'The dead don't need your guilt, they need your memory.' How do you remember someone when all you feel is regret? You start with one good thing, just one." Jake stood, collected his flowers. "That's what I do. I come here and I remember one moment when everything was good. Not perfect, just good. Human. Real." He paused. "Your son's headstone says he saw beauty in everything. That sounds like someone who knew how to be happy despite difficulty. Maybe start there." Jake walked away, leaving Thomas alone with his son and the instruction to remember one good thing. Thomas closed his eyes, reached past 15 years of guilt, past the parking lot and the funeral and the fights, reached all the way back to before the diagnosis, when Daniel was 7 and the world was still full of simple joys. A summer evening. The backyard of their Portland house. Fireflies emerging at dusk. Tiny points of light dancing through the warm air. Daniel running with cupped hands, laughing with pure delight each time he caught one. "Dad, look. They're like tiny stars I can hold." Thomas had knelt beside his son, helped him open his hands carefully. Just for a moment, then we let them go. Why? Because they need to be free to be bright. Daniel had watched the firefly crawl across his palm, then lift into flight. "It's more beautiful when it's flying, isn't it?" "Yes, buddy. It is." The memory hit Thomas like revelation. He'd taught Daniel that lesson once, about holding things gently and letting them go, about how freedom makes beauty possible. Then he'd spent 8 years after the diagnosis forgetting everything he'd once known. He'd caged his son in preparation, in protection, in fear disguised as love. And somewhere along the way, Daniel had stopped being a firefly and become something Thomas needed to control. His phone buzzed. 12 missed calls from Marie. 1 email. Subject line, "You need to see this." Thomas opened the video attachment with trembling hands. The footage showed the sanctuary. Timestamp from yesterday evening. Day 27. The White Lion father, who'd spent the entire day with his back turned to his son, suddenly stood up, walked slowly to the shelter where the cub lay sleeping, lay down beside him for the first time in 36 hours, groomed him gently for 10 minutes, the cub stirring and pressing against his father's warmth. Then the father did something Thomas hadn't expected. He stood, walked to the fence line, looked directly at the camera as if he knew Marie was filming, walked back to his son, led the cub on their route one more time, but this time walked beside him. Not ahead, not behind, beside. At the end, the father lay down and allowed his son to sleep curled against him. The message was unmistakable. I'm still here. I always was. But you can do this alone now. Distance doesn't mean abandonment. Separation doesn't mean loss. I stepped back to build your strength, not because I stopped loving you. Thomas watched the video 3 times, tears streaming freely. The father hadn't abandoned his son. He'd created necessary distance to build essential strength, then returned to show you can survive without me hovering. But I'm still here when you need me. You're not alone. You're just independent. It was everything Thomas had failed to give Daniel, the balance between presence and freedom. The trust that love doesn't require constant proximity. He pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and dialed a number he hadn't called in 12 years. Margaret answered on the 3rd ring. Thomas. Her voice. God. Her voice still carried that gentle warmth he'd fallen in love with 30 years ago. Hearing it now broke something loose in his chest. I'm at Daniel's grave, he said. You've been coming here. Every month. A long pause. Then, softly. Every month. For 15 years. Why didn't you tell me? You wouldn't have cared. Thomas, you left everyone behind. The grave. Me. Yourself. You were already gone. I'm sorry. The words felt insufficient but necessary. For everything. For not saying goodbye to him. To you. For holding on so tight I crushed everything worth holding. Margaret's breath hitched. Are you ready to let go now? I don't know, but I'm trying to learn how. That's more than you've said in 15 years. A long silence, filled with everything they'd lost. Where are you calling from France? Portland. I came home. I needed to. He looked at the headstone. I needed to finally say hello before I could say goodbye. I'm glad, Thomas. Truly. She paused. I'm getting remarried. Did you get my letter? Yes. I'm happy for you. You deserve someone who can be present. So do you. I hope you find that. They said goodbye gently. 2 people who'd loved each other once and had learned how to let that love transform into something kinder, forgiveness. Thomas sat at Daniel's grave until sunset, reading Jake's advice like scripture. Remember one good thing. He remembered fireflies. He remembered his son's laughter. He remembered the moment he'd known exactly what to teach and then, tragically, forgotten it. At the airport, booking his return flight to France. He pulled out his journal and wrote, Day 28. I ran from the ending. But the ending found me anyway. The father didn't abandon his son. He taught him strength through distance, then returned to show that love survives separation. Daniel tried to teach me this. The fireflies tried to teach me this. That white lion father finally made me understand you can hold something precious and still let it fly. In fact, you must. Because beauty requires freedom, and love requires trust. I'm going back to watch how this story ends. Not because I need a different ending for Daniel, his story is written, but because I need to witness grace, I need to see a father do it right. Then maybe I can finally believe I wasn't entirely wrong, just incomplete. I love my son. I just didn't trust him. That's the difference between caging and teaching. I finally understand. Going home, to France, to finish what I started, to watch a goodbye I can't change, and maybe learn how to give Daniel the one he deserved. The flight back to Lyon left at 11:35 p.m. Thomas boarded with red eyes, an exhausted heart, and something he hadn't felt in 15 years, hope that understanding might be possible, even when forgiveness wasn't. The flight from Portland to Lyon took 11 hours. Thomas didn't sleep. He sat in the darkness at 30,000 feet, watching his reflection in the window, occasionally catching glimpses of the Atlantic far below black water stretching toward a continent where two white lions were teaching him how to let go. He landed at 10:15 a.m. on day 29, drove straight to Saint Laurent without stopping at his cottage. The sun was climbing toward noon when he pulled into the sanctuary parking lot and found Marie sitting at his observation post, his overturned camping chair righted, a thermos of coffee waiting beside it. She looked up as he approached, but didn't seem surprised. "You came back. I had to finish watching. The lesson." "No." Thomas sat in his chair, accepted the coffee she offered. "The goodbye." Marie studied him carefully. Something in his face must have changed during his 48 hours in Portland, because she simply nodded and turned her attention back to the enclosure. "What did I miss?" Thomas asked. Day 27. The cub ate independently for the first time. Day 28. The father spent 1 hour lying beside him, then returned to distance. This morning, they've established a new pattern. Thomas looked across the enclosure and saw what she meant. The father and cub existed in flexible proximity now. Sometimes the father walked the route with his son. Sometimes the cub went alone while his father watched from the shelter entrance. Sometimes they lay in the sun together. Sometimes they were separated by the full length of the enclosure, but the father was always visible, not hovering, not controlling, just present, available without being essential. "He's teaching the final lesson," Thomas said quietly, "which is that love doesn't require constant proximity, that you can be apart and still be connected." Thomas set down his coffee. "I went to Daniel's grave. I know. I got your journal entry. I never went before, 15 years, and I never once visited my own son's grave." The shame in his voice was raw but not defensive. Simple acknowledgement. "Margaret went every month. She tended something I abandoned. And now I understand why the father had to turn his back, why he had to create that painful distance." Thomas watched the cub navigate the route independently while his father dozed in the shade. Not because he stopped caring, because caring meant trusting, and trust requires space. They sat in companionable silence for 6 hours. Thomas documented everything in his journal, but this time, he wrote from the cub's perspective, what the young lion might be feeling, the confidence building with each successful navigation, the security of knowing his father was nearby but not needed for every step. Around 5 p.m., Thomas asked Marie the question that had been building since Portland. "Do you think the cub knows his father loves him?" Marie considered this carefully. "I think the cub knows his father prepared him. Love isn't always comfort, Thomas. Sometimes it's confidence. I never gave Daniel confidence. I gave him instructions. You gave him what you knew how to give. Maybe that's all any father can do." As sunset approached, Thomas pulled out his journal and opened to the unfinished letter he'd started on day 19. The letter he'd ripped to pieces on day 27. He'd taped it back together during the flight from Portland, a Frankenstein document held together with Scotch tape and determination. Now he would finish it. He read aloud, his voice carrying across the empty space between his observation post and the fence, as if the white lions might bear witness to what he'd learned. "Dear Daniel, I'm watching a father teach his son to be blind. No, that's wrong. He's teaching him to be alive. I don't think I knew the difference. For 8 years, I taught you to navigate a world without sight. I gave you routes, sounds, markers, rules. I thought I was giving you freedom. But I was giving you my fear dressed up as preparation. This father lion, he does something I never did. He steps back. He lets his son stumble. He lets him be afraid. And then he just waits. No rushing in, no fixing, no panic. Just, I'm here when you're ready. I never waited for you to be ready. I was always 10 steps ahead, calling back, this way, son. Trust me. I never said find your own way. I trust you. That last fight we had before you went to college, you were right. I did need you to need me. Because if you didn't need me, what was I for? I know now I was supposed to be the roots while you grew branches. Instead, I tried to be the whole tree. The accident wasn't your fault. It wasn't my teaching. It was just the world being cruel and random. But my holding on, that was my fault. I made you feel like independence was rebellion instead of evolution. I'm so sorry. I'm proud of you. I was always proud. I just couldn't say it because I was too busy being afraid. You didn't need me to save you. You needed me to believe you could save yourself. I believe it now. Too late. But I do. The white lion father is leaving his son soon. He'll go to the far side of the sanctuary, and the cub will be alone. But he won't be alone. He'll be ready. You were ready, Daniel. I just couldn't see it. I love you. I release you. I'm sorry it took me 15 years to understand what I should have known the day you were born. You were never mine to keep. You were mine to prepare for the world, then trust to it. I failed the second part, but you succeeded anyway. Rest easy, son. Your old man is finally learning. Dad. Thomas folded the letter carefully, his hands steady for the first time in weeks. He would mail it to Forest Lawn Cemetery, a symbolic gesture, perhaps, but symbols mattered when you'd avoided them for 15 years. Claudette appeared as if summoned by the completion of important work. She sat beside him without asking permission, reading something in his posture. You finished it. How did you know? Because you're not holding your breath anymore. She smiled gently. You've been holding your breath for many years. I think. Now you breathe. Day 30 arrived with official ceremony. The sanctuary veterinary team pulled up at 9 a.m. scheduled health check, and the protocol Thomas had been dreading the father's relocation to an adjacent enclosure. He would remain visible, but separate. The cub would stay in the current space. Standard procedure for independence training and sanctuary animals approaching maturity. Thomas watched from his post, Marie standing beside him. The veterinary team worked with calm efficiency. The father was led, not forced, but guided to the new enclosure. He walked with dignity. No resistance, as if he understood this was the natural progression. The gate between enclosures closed with a metallic click that seemed to echo across the entire sanctuary. The cub watched from 50 yards away. Didn't panic, didn't cry out, simply watched his father settle into the new space, visible through the chain-link fence but no longer sharing territory. After the team left, the cub did something remarkable. He completed his route, perfect execution, then lay down at his favorite spot near the oak tree, occasionally glancing toward his father's new location. The father lay peacefully in his enclosure, watching his son with calm amber eyes. Both were fine. Neither was alone. The separation was complete but not absolute. Thomas wrote his final journal entry. Day 30. The father left. The son stayed. Both are okay. Neither is alone. I think I understand now. Goodbye isn't abandonment. It's graduation. Distance isn't loss. It's trust. And love isn't holding on. It's believing they'll be okay when you let go. The cub will visit his father through the fence. The father will watch his son thrive. They'll remain in each other's lives, just in new roles. I can't do that with Daniel, but I can do it with his memory. I can let him rest without needing him to haunt me. I can remember the fireflies we caught and released. I can forgive myself for being human. I can finally say, you were enough, Daniel. And you made me enough too. Goodbye, son. Not forever. Just goodbye to the guilt. I'll see you in every kind thing I do from here forward. Love. Dad. Marie's voice broke his concentration. Thomas, we need volunteer educators. People who can explain to visitors what they're seeing when they watch the animals. I'm not sure I'm qualified. You spent 32 years helping people understand grief. You spent 30 days learning to understand letting go. I think you're exactly qualified. She paused. Not training, just translation. Helping people understand wild behavior, what it teaches us about ourselves. Thomas looked at the two white lions, father and son, separated by a fence but connected by something deeper than proximity. I'll try. That's all any of us can do. 6 months later, Thomas Reed had become a fixture at Saint Laurent. He kept the cottage, refined his French, and spent his days helping visitors understand what they were witnessing when they watched the sanctuary animals. His most popular talk was called When Animals Teach Us How to Love. He specialized in explaining parent-offspring behavior, the delicate balance between protection and freedom, between presence and independence. The white lion cub, now a young adult, thrived. Strong, confident, navigating his space with the competence his father had worked so hard to instill. The father watched from the adjacent enclosure, and they interacted through the fence daily. But the son didn't need his father for survival anymore. The father's role had evolved from provider to presence, from teacher to witness. Thomas called Margaret weekly. They'd become friends, nothing more, but nothing less either. She sent him photos from her wedding. He sent her updates about the lions. They talked about Daniel sometimes, sharing memories without drowning in them. He wrote letters to Daniel's grave monthly, mailing them to Forest Lawn, where they probably got thrown away by cemetery staff. He didn't care. The writing was the point, not the delivery. One morning in early spring, a young couple approached Thomas's observation post. The woman was crying, clutching a photograph. The man explained quietly, "We lost our daughter 2 years ago. Someone at our grief group said that you understand." Thomas looked at them, so young, so broken, so achingly familiar, and felt something shift in his chest. Not pain, purpose. "I do understand. Sit with me. Let me show you something." He pointed to the father and cub, now lying parallel on opposite sides of their shared fence, close but separate, connected but independent. "See how the father is still there, but not needed every moment. That's not abandonment. That's successful parenting. Your daughter didn't leave because you failed. She left because you succeeded. You raised someone brave enough to exist in the world, even briefly." The woman's tears intensified. "How do you carry it? The pain doesn't go away." "No," Thomas agreed. "It doesn't. But you can learn to carry it differently, by trusting that love doesn't end at goodbye. It just changes form. Like those lions, the relationship didn't end. It transformed. Your daughter transformed too. She's not gone. She's just different now. Memory instead of presence. But memory can be gentle, if you let it." They stayed for an hour. Asking questions Thomas answered with hard-won wisdom. When they left, the man shook his hand. "Thank you. For the first time in 2 years, I feel like maybe we'll be okay." "You will be," Thomas said with certainty. "Not today, maybe not this year, but you will be." That evening, Thomas sat alone at his observation post, watching the white lions in their separate spaces. The cub released a powerful roar, his first full adult vocalization. The father answered with his own roar, deeper and resonant. Neither moved toward the other. Both were content. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile in 15 years that reached all the way to his eyes and stayed there. He whispered to the wind, to Daniel, to whatever force in the universe made fathers and sons and the inevitable space between them. "Thank you for teaching me what I couldn't teach myself. I'm ready now, not to forget, never to forget, but to remember with peace instead of pain, to hold you gently, like fireflies, to let you glow." In the distance, the white lion father settled into sleep, his work complete. His son, blind but capable, stood watch over their shared territory. And Thomas Reed, 66 years old and finally learning how to breathe, understood at last. The hardest part of love is trusting it works even when you step away. The greatest goodbye is the one that says, "You're ready. I believe in you. I love you enough to let you fly." He stayed until sunset, at peace for the first time since a parking lot in Portland had shattered his world. The lions taught him what 15 years of running couldn't. Some stories end, but love transforms. And in that transformation, if you're brave enough to allow it, you find not closure but continuation. A different kind of presence. A gentler kind of holding on. The kind that finally feels like freedom. I'll tell you what that white lion father taught me, and it's not what I expected to learn. For 30 years, I counseled grieving parents. I told them grief was something you carry differently, not something you get over. But I never applied those words to myself. When Daniel died, I didn't carry grief, I became it. I wrapped myself so completely in loss that I forgot I'd once been a father who knew how to love without suffocating. That lion showed me what I'd forgotten. Preparing someone you love means teaching them they can survive without you. Not because you don't matter, but because you mattered enough to build their strength instead of their dependence. Family isn't proximity. It's not hovering or controlling or preventing every possible hurt. Family is roots that hold steady while branches grow toward their own light. It's trusting that what you planted will bear fruit even when you can't see it anymore. I'm grateful I ran to France. Grateful I found those lions. Grateful I finally learned that loving someone completely means loving them enough to let go, not because they need less, but because you taught them well enough that they're ready. That's not loss. That's legacy. And Daniel, wherever you are, I finally understand. You were always ready. I just needed to believe it.